It is week 14 in the NFL. And that means one of two things. Either you're ready to play for a fantasy championship or your season is over. Either way, crack a beer. Dwain McFarland and I got you covered. It is the Fantasy Football Hustle Playoff Edition. Welcome in, everybody. I am Brian Drake of FightingChanceFantasy.com. Joined as always by my main man, Dwain McFarland of EstablishTheRun.com and MattWaldmanRSP.com and Football Guys and a million other great places. And it is my favorite time of the week. We weren't here last week with the holiday, but I get to talk football with my main man, Dwain. I got a lot on my plate here, Dwain. But first of all, how was your holiday? I hope everything is good with you and the family and the kids.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Everything was great. It's always a good time hanging out, eating food, watching lots of football. I mean, I have no complaints. How about you?
Brother, our football teams suck. You're a Cowboys fan. I'm an Eagles fan. This is an embarrassment. We're so bad. Like I told you before the show even started, I kind of just want the Eagles to lose out at this point and just get a better draft pick. Nobody deserves to win this NFC East.
Yeah, it's terrible. I will say I feel like the Cowboys, the talent, there's a lot of good things going for them. It's you have to put it on the coaches, I think, at this point, because Dak has played better than anybody thought. Amari Cooper has played elite. Ezekiel Elliott, yeah, he hasn't been quite as good, but they've also lowered his volume. He's still been decent. The offensive line has probably underperformed, but at the end of the day, they've been losing games for silly reasons. They got blown out by Buffalo, but the week before against New England, I mean, they lost in the kicking game. They lost on special teams. They've found a lot of silly ways to lose games this year. So, I mean, I put a lot of it, on coaching. I'm not sure how you're feeling. At least the Bills have a winning record, but losing to the Dolphins,
we beat the Bills.
Drake, you lost to the Dolphins.
It's so embarrassing.
That's insane.
Do you think Jason Garrett makes the year?
Yeah, I think he'll make the year. I mean, Jerry Jones has already come on the record and said, he doesn't believe that making a coaching change right now is going to ultimately benefit the team. But I think if Garrett doesn't win the Super Bowl, or at least get to the Super Bowl, he's gone. So he's most likely gone. I mean, Dallas will probably win the East, and then they're just going to get bounced like big time in the first round. They'll have to play a Minnesota or Seattle, or heck, I think right now it could end up being like the 49ers or something. I mean, any one of those teams, is just going to
get a home
Dallas.
game. So
yeah, but I mean, the inability to stop the run has been huge, for this defense. Any team that's been able to run the ball at all has just, destroyed them. So
we'll get into all the teams here. And the way we're going to do it, folks, is we know by the time you're listening to this, you've probably already put your waiver claims in. Most of you listen to this Wednesday, Thursday, and we appreciate it on the Full-Time Fantasy Podcast Network. And what we're going to do is go team by team, and we're going to hit kind of the relevant points, and I'll do it in a waiverish type order. So it's the most relevant guys you're looking for. And we're going to start at the top with the Minnesota Vikings. Dalvin Cook, he's had this shoulder injury now, Dwain, for a while, and I guess he's had a couple of surgeries on it. Might have injured it a week ago, and last night really had it flare up on him. Enter the guy that we've been telling everybody in America to stash all season long, Alexander Mattison. He rushes 4 times for 22, catches 4 balls for 51. They get the Lions next week. I'm not as optimistic as some when they say, oh, Dalvin Cook says he can play next week. He'll be good. He'll be in there. Don't worry about it. I don't buy that for a second.
Yeah, I don't either. With what he's got going on, it could easily be, even if he does start the game, you're going to be holding your breath all game that he doesn't re-injure it. I mean, playing running back specifically, you take a lot of shots in that area, because you're taught, to get lower than your opponent. And so when you're doing that, and that's the way you're running, and if you don't, you expose yourself to other types of injuries. But whenever you're trying to always be the lowest man winning, there's a lot of contact, to your shoulders, as a running back. So I think it's going to be a problem. In fact, it just depending on how things go, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they just sit him, because Madison really has been, really good. Now, the thing that Dalvin Cook has going for him, is just the fact that, Minnesota needs to keep winning. That was a tough loss against the Seahawks on Monday night, losing by a touchdown. And so, I mean, they've got to keep winning to keep things going. So it's not like they can let their foot off the gas. But like I said, Madison's been really good. And yeah, absolutely. It sucks for Dalvin Cook owners because Dalvin Cook is one of the players you and I were just talking before we started, kind of going back and looking at, the players and where we drafted guys and then how they've performed and guys that if you drafted them, you're likely doing really well. And Dalvin Cook is one of those names, right? If you took Dalvin Cook in the second round and if you drafted early, sometimes he was going in the early third round. Drafted, back in the early summer drafts. I think there's people that have him and McCaffrey, paired together. But if you have Dalvin Cook, he's likely been one of the key guys that you've been leaning on all year. And then you had to take a bye week, heading into what was probably the first week of your playoffs for many of the folks out there. And then now he's going to be injured and you're going to be concerned about it, but if you're, the owner that owns Alexander Mattison and you've rostered him already and you're not, it's not, the Dalvin Cook owner, and you happen to make the playoffs and you're in, well, then this is a guy that you're really going to be considering, this weekend because you have a great matchup. And it's just something where I'm with you, Drake. I don't trust Dalvin Cook. Now, I've got Dalvin Cook in some leagues where I'm in the playoffs, and obviously I'm going to put him in there. I don't own Madison in two of the leagues where I've made the playoffs with Cook on my roster, so I have no choice. I'm going to have to play Dalvin Cook. We'll see how the practice reports look. It's tough, it's going to be tough to leave him, out. But if I were the Madison owner, and I have to go back and check now on any of my other teams that are in the playoffs if I own Madison, but I'll be very tempted, to have him in there. I wouldn't be surprised to see him lead the way.
It's going to be one of those scenarios where you were just mentioning. It happens every year. You've got this guy, he's a stud, you rode him the whole season, and then you get to the fantasy playoffs. He plays in the first quarter, re-aggravates it, sits down, and just all his owners get bounced. But what can you do? And if you're looking at this receiving core in Minnesota, we'll stick with the Vikings. Diggs, quiet night last night, 9 targets, went 4 for 25. Thielen's still not out there. He's got this hamstring injury, so he's not playing, and that's hurting people who invested a high pick in Adam Thielen. The one guy, though, Dwain, it is helping is Kyle Rudolph. So if you're dying on the waiver wire at tight end, Rudolph is, you just told me before the show, now he's up to tight end 13. They call him the couch. Like, he catches everything they throw his way.
Yeah, Rudolph, is a guy that was he happened to be the odd man out, in this QBX scheme, which typically, goes around 3 players. We didn't anticipate Dalvin Cook being so involved in the passing game, at least in my initial projections. I thought 12 to 13%. He's sitting at 16% right now. At some points in the season, he's been almost at 20% target share. But Rudolph, over the last few games, because as you mentioned, with Adam Thielen being out, he's really carved out, a role. He's playing, almost 90% of the snaps each game. And the good thing for Rudolph now that wasn't occurring early in the season is his routes per dropback are almost directly in line with his snaps since Thielen's been out. So, in week 11, 87% of the snaps played ran a route on 80% of the passing plays. On week 13, 85% of the snaps he played ran a route on 84%. So, when he's on the field, he's actually being used as a receiver more. Early in the season, we would hear, Kyle Rudolph played 90% of the snaps, but only ran a route on 60%, of those snaps. And the reason why is because he was staying into blocks. So he's not doing that now. They're prioritizing him as a receiver. Irv Smith has also been more involved. If you look at them as a duo, Drake, since week 7, 36%, 24%, 29%, 35%, 24%. And then last week, 21% target share between the 2 tight ends. And typically Kyle Rudolph is the lead. Now, the thing that makes Kyle Rudolph so valuable is he's the guy getting those targets in the end zone. He's up to 7 end zone targets, on the season, which is tied for first on the team. Actually, it's second. Adam Thielen still leads at 8, but he and Diggs now have 7 apiece as far as targets in the end zone.
And on that crucial 4th down last night with the game on the line, they threw a little 3-yard out to Irv Smith. He was the guy that was targeted on that play, which surprised the hell out of me. It wasn't really a great route or a great throw, but we'll move on to the Kansas City Chiefs. I have, along with your buddy from Football Guys, Drew, he and I have this kind of irrational love for Darrell Williams. All right. So we played him anytime Darrell Williams does anything, we go crazy. We type on Twitter and all that. But Darrell Williams is hurt. He had a really bad non-contact injury. I doubt he plays this week or probably any week for the rest of the season. Damian Williams is banged up. He's got this rib cartilage issue. LaShawn McCoy's 100 years old. Enter Darwin Thompson, the guy everybody in a best ball league drafted, 3-4 months ago. He comes in 44 yards and a rushing touchdown. Then they go sign Spencer Ware today. Dwayne, they're saying Damien's got a shot at playing. Everyone wants Darwin Thompson. Now you got Spencer Ware and McCoy. This is a disaster, especially if my fantasy playoffs are on the line and I got to pick one of these guys. Like, people are going to spend their first waiver claim tonight on Darwin Thompson. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, he has to be in the mix just because of the offense he's in, and we saw how explosive he can be. He's a guy that, when you look at his athleticism, it's off the charts. A guy that was very productive in college, and he lands in a really good place. It's a guy that Matt Waldman loves. As he was, in the RSP, for the folks that haven't heard of that, the rookie scouting portfolio, Darwin Thompson was ranked, very, highly by Matt. So, and he's a great fit, for this offense. So, I mean, he has to be in the mix. Now, to your point, I mean, LaShawn McCoy, yes, he's old, but he's not going to go away. Darrell Williams this last weekend played 26% of the snaps, 35% to Darwin Thompson, 37% to LaShawn McCoy. Now you sign Spencer Ware. Spencer Ware is a guy that was just with this team, 2 seasons ago. He knows Andy Reid's offense. It's not like it's been 5 or 6 years since he played in Andy Reid's offense. So
exactly,
he's probably going to be active if Damian Williams is still out with the rib injury, and if Darrell Williams, it does sound like he's going to miss this game. It's also not a super great matchup with the Patriots. But, the Patriots aren't quite as good as what folks, really thought. We're seeing that a lot of that was due to their schedule. So, I mean, Thompson's a guy that I don't blame folks. I mean, you're going to have him, in the mix, because what you're hoping is that he just explodes. And then all of a sudden, the Chiefs, start winning even more, and they get on this run, and they just let Darwin Thompson, take half to 60%, of the work at running back. What we've seen so far this year, though, I mean, you're just hoping, because what we've seen so far this year is no matter what, even whether all 3 guys are healthy or whether it's just 2 and they're working in someone else, is that Andy Reid has really moved to more of a committee approach this season. So yeah, I get it. If folks are looking at adding, if you're staring down Madison and you're staring down Darwin Thompson, you're staring down Benny Snell. I mean, I know there's some other guys we'll probably talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still putting Madison at the top of the list, Drake. And the reason why is because if Dalvin Cook doesn't go, he clearly is the top guy. Yeah. And that this running game for, the Vikings has been the thing that they've really leaned on, and it's a great scheme. Whereas with Kansas City, even if Damian Williams and Darrell Williams don't play, you still don't know for sure what you're getting with Darwin Thompson. Most likely, you're not even going to put him in your lineup. You're just going to hope that he explodes and that you get to use him the next week, right? That's probably going to be more of your approach heading into, your playoff game. Can you imagine, Drake, having to put Darwin Thompson into your lineup and depend on him in the playoffs? I think it's going to be tough.
So here's a little stat I saw, and it's, maybe you could ease some people's minds, because last year the Pats and the Chiefs played twice. In those 2 games, in terms of receiving, the Kansas City running backs had 3 combined receptions for touchdowns, about 170 yards, also on 10 catches. So they do give up some production there. I think Houston had the blueprint for how to beat this Patriots team. And I'm sure you watched that game. It was amazing to me, Dwayne, as we kind of shift to the Patriots now, I guess. They picked them apart by saying, we're going to go at your slow, antiquated linebackers, and you're not going to be able to cover our tight ends and guys breaking into the middle of the field. You want Gilmore to be on the outside and do his thing? Great. But boy, did they take advantage in the middle of the field. And it was basically the same thing, minus Lamar Jackson, that Baltimore did in terms of just killing the Patriots in the middle of the field and saying, hey, Patrick Chung, you suck. I'm surprised you're still in the league. And they're just eating up yardage, play after play after play. That just stood out to me. And I'm wondering if Travis Kelce's in line for a big game, because I'm sure Gilmore will be locked up on Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. The other thing to consider is that Tyreek Hill is just one of those guys that it only takes one play, right? And,
yep.
And as good as Stephon Gilmore is, he's not as fast as Tyreek Hill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's something where, Tyreek Hill it's a bad matchup, but he's a player that, could still explode, for a big fantasy game just with 1 or 2 plays. And if you think about it, we haven't had that many huge games from Tyreek Hill. He and Mahomes have, kind of traded places being injured, right, or being dinged up.
Yeah.
So, but they're just now both, it looks like, returning to full health. So, Hill's still a guy that, I would have highly rated heading into the weekend, but I think you make a really good point. I think that is the best way to attack the Patriots. And that's where the Cowboys really struggled, because Jason Witten, he got open and he did some things, but he just wasn't able to do much after the catch. He had a couple of drops. So working inside against those guys, the Cowboys tried to get Randall Cobb going. They weren't super successful with that. But yeah, I think Kansas City could do some things based on having Kelsey, using some motion to move Tyreek Hill around. You could also move, Sammy Watkins around. I mean, if you look at last week, Tyreek Hill played 52% of his snaps from the slot. Sammy Watkins played 56% of his snaps from the slot. So Andy Reid does a nice job of moving those guys all over the place.
Friend of the show, Sigmund Bloom, was tweeting out today how he was watching the film on this Kansas City team, and he was like, how do they not have Mecole Hardman as a bigger part of this offense? That guy is just an explosive play waiting to happen. And I frankly agree. He's a hell of a player, and it's tough to match the speed of Hill and Hardman on the outside.
I think the biggest thing this weekend, Drake, is that the Chiefs won by 31 points. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, they played a ton of 12 personnel. So they had Travis Kelce, played 91% of the snaps. Blake Bell played 52% of the snaps. So they just weren't using they weren't going to 4 wide very often at all. And when they were using 3 wide, they went with the better blockers. Sammy Watkins and Demarcus Robinson are just better blockers at this stage in their career than Mecole Hardman, who's just a small, fast guy. If you looked at the week before, the Chiefs did tip their hand in a game where they were in much more of a shootout.
Hardman played a ton that game.
Yeah, he played 76% of the snaps. He ran a route on 86% of the dropbacks, which was number 1 on the team besides Travis Kelce in Week 11. So some of that is game script. So I think Mecole Hardman, if you're just trying to really grind down the clock and get out of there with a win, he's not the guy you're going to see out there on the field. And the Chiefs never really needed to use him. I mean, this game was over before it started. Mm-hmm. This got out of hand pretty quickly on the Raiders.
Up in Seattle, a lot of guys last week spent a waiver claim on Rashad Penny, and they were rewarded 15 carries, 74 yards, and a rushing touchdown. Also added 4 receptions for 33 yards and a score through the air. But it's not like Chris Carson didn't get any work, Dwain. He had 24 touches, 109 yards, and a touch too. So a potential messy situation, but it looks like Seattle's offense can support both of these guys. Back in the day, they used to play hide the quarterback with Russell Wilson and not throw much. And could we be going back to that where they want to feature these 2 backs?
Well, I mean, the thing that's helping, Seattle right now, Drake, is they're running 67 plays a game. So if you're running, if you look at Week 13 was 75 plays in the game. So in that type of game script, or in that type of game, you can support, 2 running backs. Mm-hmm. And so I think the key takeaway for listeners here is we do have a true split committee. We have what folks thought we were going to have, back when the preseason began. If you remember, at one point, Rashad Penny passed Chris Carson in ADP, and then it flipped back towards the end, and Carson got as high, Carson then shot to the, mid early 3rd round. You started seeing folks take him. But if you look at the last 2 weeks, 51% of the snaps and 49%, that's for Carson and Penny in Week 12. Mm-hmm. And then in Week 13, 52% and 47%. What's interesting is what we thought we would see at the beginning of the year is more what we saw in Week 13. 55% of the rushing attempts to Chris Carson, Drake, 36% to Rashad Penny. But Rashad Penny ran a route on 53% of Russell Wilson's dropbacks and was the guy they used in the receiving game. It's interesting because the week before it was the exact opposite. Chris Carson only had 31% of the carries, 54% of the rushing went to Rashad Penny, but Chris Carson was the guy in the passing game, and then Rashad Penny was not used as much in the passing game. So in each of the last 2 weeks, Chris Carson, 16% of the targets Week 13, Week 12, 16% of the targets to Chris Carson. So to me, you've really got a 50-50 situation. We don't know for sure who's going to be the lead ball carrier, who's going to be the guy used more as receiver. They're trying to get both guys involved. Week 13, both of them had 2 carries inside the 5. And Rashad Penny actually had a target in the end zone. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think both guys are now in play. I think Rashad Penny makes for a nice flex. Chris Carson is a running back 2. He doesn't have quite the ceiling that he had before, because I think now, in a big blowout type situation, he's not going to have 30 carries. I think he's capped at 22, 23 touches a game, and that's in a perfect scenario. because of how well Rashad Penny is actually playing.
We got a lot of guys in the chat room talking and asking questions here. One gentleman's asking, can I play Penny and Carson together in a lineup this week? So he obviously had the handcuff to Carson. Now they're both worthy of playing. Would you play both of them together?
I don't necessarily have an issue with that in this offense because of how much they like to run the ball. So if you look at Seattle on the season, Drake, they're at 56% of the time, they're actually dropping back to pass the ball. And so if you look at that from a league perspective, that ranks 27th in the league. So what's the opposite of that is running. So they are running the ball on 44% of their plays, which is tied for fourth best in the league. So when you have an offense that's running the ball and you have an offense that whenever you look at their plays per game, which we already talked about, and they actually rank sixth. So they run the ball all the time. They rank sixth in plays per game. That's a situation where you can actually start both of those runners. Now, it depends on who else you have, but there's not many teams that you would do that with. Seattle's on a very short list of teams where I would actually feel comfortable doing that, but they are one of the teams I would feel that I would consider doing it if I needed to.
I did that last year with Mike Davis and Chris Carson, I think, at one point. I used both, and they came through. I think I won that game. So the guys, this is the Fantasy Football Hustle. We appreciate it. Brian Drake, Dwain McFarland, rocking and rolling here. You, of course, can go over to establishtherun.com and read Dwain's work there with the utilization report. How are things going at ETR, man? I'm a big fan of the work that Adam and Evan are doing. What can people expect from your article this week?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about some of it here, but, I think and folks will hear more of it as we go on, but we're reaching that point in the season, and I even saw a few questions earlier today on our feed, where you're looking at teams and are they, because some of these teams are out of it, they're just starting to shut certain players down. So I'll be talking about some of that in the column, and who are some of the folks that, you can be looking at, having larger roles, along with some of the normal stuff, the injuries, or just some of the trends that seem to be emerging. And some of these teams that are really making a playoff push, they're very interesting to study as well, because, they're really trying to hone in. What are they going to be, for these last few months of the season, or for this last month and a half, if you think about it from a number of games left, if you're heading into the playoffs, what are they going to be?
Yeah, so head over there, establishtherun.com. I think we still have a promo code that works, Dwain, Hustle20. Yes, if not, they've got a lot of good content there. And Adam and Evan Silva, they do a show on Friday night they call the Kama Sutra Show, where they go position by position. If you're a DFS fan, you'll really enjoy that. They keep it moving. It's about 90 minutes, but it's really great content. So we're always happy to plug those guys. Keeping it moving here, we'll stick in the NFC West with the San Francisco 49ers. And my boy, Matt Breida, of course, when I need him, he's not in the lineup. So here comes Raheem Mostert for a $146 and a touchdown against the Ravens. Yeah, Dwain, I'm going to kill myself here.
Yeah.
What are we doing with these guys?
Yeah, it's just tough, man. If you look at the previous, and this is where, you can look at all the trends, you can do everything you want. If you look at the previous, Drake, if you look at the previous weeks, all the way back to week 6, Tevin Coleman, 56, 66, 48, 53, 49, 51, 60% of the snaps. This last weekend, 18%. Raheem Mostert, 73%. The Shanahans will do that to you. Sometimes there's nothing you can do.
He outtouched Coleman 21-6.
Yeah, 66% of the carries versus 17. The two previous weeks, 63% for Coleman versus 32 for Mostert, 50% for Coleman, 27% for Mostert. I mean, this was a game that was perfectly set up for Tevin Coleman, to be the guy to do what Raheem Mostert did. I was expecting 20 points out of Tevin Coleman, not 23 points out of Raheem Mostert and 3 points out of Tevin Coleman. Now you're going to get Matt Breida back. We know that it'll primarily be Coleman and Breida, but Mostert has played it well enough that we know that they like to use him as the third guy, and he may have even carved out a little bit more of a role. So it's tough, as good as this ground game is for the 49ers, unlike the Seahawks, it's not 2 guys, it's 3. It's going to be 3 now, and it's primarily 2 with a third guy chipping in, but it's just enough to really kind of, throw a wet blanket, on any ideas of starting these guys or really being able to trust them.
Would you add Mostert if you're looking to pick some guys up this week? No.
I mean, again, it depends on the league, but you're just going to feel sick about having to put him in.
Mm-hmm.
with Breida coming back and Coleman playing, and I mean, you're very likely looking at a scenario where Coleman's slightly going to lead the backfield, Breida's going to be next, and Mostert's going to be third.
All right, let's talk about these wide receivers here. Emmanuel Sanders has been real quiet. So in his last 4 games, the guy only has 16 total targets, and he's got 10 catches for 104 yards. Deebo Samuel, on the other hand, he only has 4 catches in his last 2 games, but he's scored in each. So, at least you're kind of cashing in there. You're getting something. Kittle's returned, so he's obviously the 1A in that offense. But, boy, it's tough to feel confident about any of these Niners pass catchers on the outside, Dwayne.
Yeah, it is tough because this is also a team that, while they're running plenty of plays, 65 plays a game, they will go heavy on the run like the Seahawks. So if you look at the last 2 weeks, their drop back rate, 53% and 49%. They're at 50% on the season. I mean, Drake, that's the least amount of passing of any team in the league. So if you look at Emmanuel Sanders, you look at Deebo Samuel, the good thing for Sanders is 29% of the targets this last week went to Sanders. 19% went to Deebo, 14% to George Kittle, 10% to Mostert, 5% to Coleman. So, I talked about this in my column last week for Establish the Run, that really Deebo and Emmanuel Sanders they'll trade off each week of who's going to be the 2 to George Kittle. And occasionally one of them will be the 1 and Kittle will be the 2. And that's what happened. It just didn't show up for Emmanuel Sanders in the box score. And it was a tough matchup with the Ravens. They've got cornerbacks just literally coming out of their ears. So it's not an easy team to go play. Anywhere you line up, you're going to have your hands full, with the cornerback that's lining up across from you. But the good news for those 2 guys is they've pretty much, they've settled in on them. So both of those guys, Drake, ran a route on 100% of the team's dropbacks, Deebo and Sanders. So if you are having to take a risk in a deeper league on putting one of those 2 in, that's a really good thing because that wasn't something that we were seeing. It's been a trend that we've seen growing, and it kind of crescendoed this last weekend in a very competitive game, which they lost to Baltimore by 3 points. Mm-hmm. It is those 2 guys. So the good news is that you have a piece of a good offense. To your point, the negative is you don't know which one it's going to be. The other negative is if they can run the ball all day, they will. So Deebo, yep, he's made the most of his opportunities, but Sanders is the one that's slightly more involved.
This week they're at the Saints. Do you think Lattimore shadows Sanders, or do you think he just kind of plays a side?
My gut would say he's going to play a side. Based on, the way this has really worked out. We talked about this in the past, what are defenses studying? They're studying the last several weeks. So really, if you look at it over, and this isn't perfect math because I'm averaging averages here, 18% of the targets over the last 5 weeks to Deebo, over that same period, 17% to Emmanuel Sanders. So really, they've been spreading the ball across both of those guys. Even if you do that just over the last 3 games, it's 16% for Deebo and it's 15% for Sanders. So I am anticipating Lattimore sticking to one side of the field. They could choose to have him follow one of those 2 guys, but as far as trying to guess who it's going to be, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it.
I don't know if he's out there on your wires, folks, but if Darius Geis is out there, you got to add this guy. We mentioned it a few weeks ago. He was coming back from his injury and now he returned. He didn't lead the team in carries. AP still did that, but Geis blows up. 10 carries for 129 and 2 scores against Carolina. Also got 3 targets. That's nice. AP added 99 yards himself. They get Green Bay this week. Green Bay is a sieve against the run. Does the usage of AP give you pause? And now we have Chris Thompson returning also. With Geis, or do you think Geis is going to be a focal point of the team that forgot how to tank?
Man, it's tough to say. It bothers me. I mean, because if you look at it, really, it's a 3-man backfield. It's
that they forgot how to tank, or they're using 3 players.
That they're using 3 players. Oh, they're going to tank. I mean, this team is really not. What are they doing? They're just managing games. That's what they're doing. They're managing games by not putting, Dwayne Haskins in situations to turn the ball over. They're playing decent defense. They're running the football. That's a recipe you can use against a lot of teams in the league, Drake, and you just let the other team beat themselves, right? And that's kind of, that's been their recipe under Callahan since he took over is let's really try to reestablish this ground game. Let's not beat ourselves. And, I mean, it's not like it's worked great. They lost by 10 in week 11, lost by 3 in week 12. So it got a little closer. And then they won by 8 in week 13. Their average margin of victory on the season is still minus 9.7. So while they're playing slightly better, they still have a rookie quarterback. If they get behind early, it's going to be the Chris Thompson show. They are playing Green Bay, a formidable opponent. We know Green Bay has shown a tendency this year to show up small at certain points, but I would expect Green Bay to carve Washington up pretty good. Maybe not quite as much as they did to the Giants last week, but I would expect them to put up a similar performance. And that's what you have to worry about. If they really get behind, Chris Thompson played 36% of the snaps. He's clearly the guy they want out there in passing downs. This past weekend, he ran a route on 41% of the dropbacks, 22% for Geis, 16% for Adrian Peterson. And that's the killer, is that. If it was just Peterson and Geis, I would feel better because Geis, is really the better receiver of the two. So if they're splitting carries, and then all of a sudden, Geis is the guy getting the work in the passing game. You're in a situation where you're like, okay, it's a team that wants to run the ball. We at least know in the first half of the game, assuming they're not getting killed by then, he could put some value out there. And if they manage to hang around in a game, maybe he scores you, a touchdown late or something. So the problem is Washington is still bad. Yeah. And you're splitting this between 3 guys. So it scares me. But, Geis looked really good. And there's still this thing called talent. I know we talk about utilization a lot, and that's, a key component to the show, but there's no, doubting, how good Geis looks. He looks very determined. He looked explosive. He looked fresh. I mean, he was making big plays. He had 2 attempts inside the 5. He had 1 in week 11. So he owns all 3 of the attempts inside the 5 since he's been back. Peterson hasn't gotten any of those. So that's a positive for him. So yeah, Geis is obviously a guy that you're going to put at the top of the board. If I'm looking at it this week, and I've got, we've talked about Madison, we've talked about Geis,
Penny, maybe he's out there.
We've talked about Penny. We've talked about Darwin Thompson. I think, and you got to have a guy that you just know that you have to make a call now. You got to make a call right now tonight. Which guy would I feel the best about putting in my lineup this weekend? It would be Geis, and a lot of it ties back to the way he played, but also what you talked about, the matchup with Green Bay and how bad they are against the run. They're giving up 1.8 more points in a PPR format to running backs than the rest of the league. So that's a very good matchup, for Washington.
We just had a guy in our chat room ask me if he should pick up and start Nelson Aguilar, and I almost threw my computer out into the snow. Don't pick up Nelson Aguilar, anyone, all right? Forget that. Abandon ship on all Eagles. We had another guy, Dwain, asking about someone you and I talked about off air, and that's Kenyon Drake, my brother from another mother. We used to be the show without hats, and now we've added hats and glasses. So we're constantly evolving here on the hustle. But tell me your thoughts on Kenyon Drake. One of our guys in the chat room wants to flex him this week. And I mean, the guy's getting the usage. He's the man in Arizona. They just got boat race this past weekend.
Yeah. I mean, Kenyon Drake is the only back right now, and it could change, but he's the only back on this team that I would feel comfortable playing. I mean, it's kind of funny, Drake. I mean, David Johnson is 24% of the snaps last week, 12% the week before. And Chase Edmonds was healthy, but he didn't even see a snap this last weekend. If you look at the rushing attempts, over the last several weeks, 65%, 56%, 64%, 62% for Kenyon Drake. So it's pretty consistent. I mean, he's right in that 60 to 65% range, whereas David Johnson had 28%. Then he missed, some time. He missed week 11, then 19% week 13. So, I mean, they're going with Kenyon Drake as their 1A right now. Now, I don't know. Is it because David Johnson's still dinged up and we don't know? I mean, they're not saying that. It's not showing up on the injury report. So I think we just have to assume right now that they like Kenyon Drake. He gives them more of a spark. He's much faster than David Johnson. His target strike, 21% and 18% the last 2 weeks. So
I had Kenyon Drake in my big home league, the only league that I care about, and of course didn't make the playoffs because why would the commissioner make the playoffs? I just pour my heart and soul into this damn league with all my old fraternity brothers and friends from here in Syracuse, but I digress.
I mean, but the matchup is tough, versus Pittsburgh. That's a minus 3.9, versus, they give up 3.9 less points to running backs in a PPR format, per game than the rest of the league. So that's one of the better run defenses in the league. But the usage is there for sure.
Yeah.
He's playing 80% of the snaps, getting over half of the carries, and he's in the 15 to 20% range as far as a receiver out of the backfield.
The guy I traded Drake for is Devontae Parker, and Parker is balling out.
Yeah, who knew? He just needed Ryan Fitzpatrick his whole career, I guess. I don't know.
Don't we all? So if you need a streaming quarterback out there, if Tannehill's taken, Tannehill would be my guy that I'd love to have in there. But Fitzpatrick, I mean, man, the guy's just going off. If you read my column over at Fighting Chance Fantasy, I do a roundtable every week. My bust of the week was the Eagles defense. I said they're going to give up 303 to Fitzmagic, and lo and behold, they gave up 303 to Fitzmagic. And Parker is a beast. If you got him, maybe if you're in a small league, he could still be on the waiver wire. Who knows? But get him in the lineup. Let's move down through this Dolphins team as we're talking.
Just real quick, Drake. Listen to Parker. This is insane. This is we talk about this stuff every week. We analyze it. Listen to it. These are his PPR points by week for the season: 11, 0, 9, 17 by week. 12, 17, 12, 16, 12, 21, 15, and 35. Who would – it's insane.
In the NFL over the last 4 games, he's fourth in targets, first in receiving yards, third in air yards. The guy's blowing up.
Yeah, he's getting 20% of the targets on the year, but over the last 2 weeks, 26% and 26%. He's got 7 targets in the end zone. He's 33% of the Dolphins' air yards. His average depth of target is 14.6. I mean, yeah, he's on a terrible team, but Fitzpatrick is making him viable because he's willing to take chances and push the ball down the field.
What do you think of Mike Gesicki in that offense? He's got 6+ targets in his last 5 games.
We talked about him last week.
Yeah.
We talked about him actually being a bona fide, tight end 1 at this point, in the season. 13%, 18, and 18% over the last 3 weeks. Those are his targets. He's got 3 end zone targets over the last 3 games. Routes per drop back are right where you want him to be as a tight end. I mean, he's an elite company there, 92%, 92%, and 81%. So yeah, Mike Gesicki, when I look at this team, he's really the second guy that I would want to own. And then it's Alan Hearns, and then it's Albert Wilson. So, Kalen Ballage is out for the season. He's gone. So Patrick Laird, played 50% of the rushing attempts last week, and he is a guy that's actually pretty good out of the backfield as a pass receiver. But that went down this last week. That went up 42%. I was looking at Ballage, but he had 13% of the targets in this last game. So yeah, Patrick Laird is another guy. Now, Miami.
Can we add him? In real life, I know he's a big joke on Twitter and all this, but Kalen Ballage is on IR. They just brought in Zach Zenner. They've also got Myles Gaskins. They can't run the ball at all. I watched the entire game last week.
Yeah, the thing I like about him is they use him as the pass receiver. And that's all you're looking for from Miami. And the matchups aren't terrible. They have the Jets, the Giants, and they get the Bengals, which is a great matchup. So,
Jesus.
Yeah, if you're really hurting, look, how many times have we just glossed over the Dolphins all year? So many times on this show.
It's week 14, so 14 times.
Yeah. So look, they were just due. We had to give them a little bit of love, Drake. But yeah, in an absolute pinch, you want the guy, especially in PPR and in half-point PPR, he's the guy that's going to be getting the looks in the passing game, and that's what helps you.
Don't look now, but the Steelers actually could make the playoffs. I know this because every a-hole Steelers fan and my Facebook and Twitter feed just continually blows it up with, if your team lost this guy and that guy and that guy, they'd never be as good as the Steelers. Settle down, okay? You're starting a guy named Duck Hodges at quarterback, all right? The AFC kind of sucks outside of the top 2 teams. So Connor's out. We don't know when he's going to play. Benny Snell didn't start. That was Jalen Samuels, but overtook him with 16 carries for 63 and a touch. So, if Benny Snell, if he's out there, Dwain, spot start, are you feeling good about him going against Arizona? They could run up and down the field on these guys.
Yeah, he goes in that same group, that we just talked about, and I would feel comfortable starting him if I had to. The problem is, Benny Snell, we know what he is. If the game doesn't go the way they want and they happen to trail, Benny Snell's screwed. So if it's a game though where it's kept close, or the Steelers are leading, then you can expect Benny Snell to see, 15 carries or so, and he might score you a touchdown. But he's a non-factor in the passing game. He doesn't run routes, doesn't see a lot of targets. So you just need the game script to go your way. You look at the last 2 weeks, 55% and 50% of the rushing attempts. Jalen Samuels has basically been taken out of the rushing role, only 5% and 22% of the carries. However, Jalen Samuels is the man when it comes to, the receiving game. His routes per drop back 45% and 52%, and then his targets 11% and 10%. So it's truly this is one of those situations where one of the guys just the runner, the other guy's pretty much just the pass receiver, and you're in an offense that only runs 59 plays a game, only ran 54 plays last week, and you've got your third string quarterback. So it's not super exciting, but like you said, they have a reason to be playing, and they get Arizona, which is a +2 running back matchup, this weekend.
They're going to win again. It's crazy. How about your boy James Washington? 4 for 111 and a touchdown. He's got 3 of his last 4 games with a score. Led the team with 100 air yards. These aren't, very pretty passes. They're kind of just like backyard alley-oops that this guy's coming down with. But, hey, if Juju's not playing, someone's going to catch the damn ball.
But the thing is, that's what James Washington's good at. Remember, we talked about this in the preseason. If you go vertical down the field, especially against zone-type coverages, and you let James Washington just win at the point, at the point of attack, with the ball, that's what he's really good at. And his average depth of target over the last 2 weeks has been 18.1, and then last week 24.5. So his average depth of target on the season is 16.4. Now, last week, what was nice for him, he played out of the slot 61% of those snaps, and that was part of Juju being gone. So now he got to play the third corner, and they kept him working the vertical area of the field. So he was getting a mismatch, and they were letting him go do what he's best at. If they keep doing that, that's a good thing for James Washington.
If you're in a pinch, guys, and you need a tight end, he hasn't been amazing, but Vance McDonald gets the Cardinals this week. They've given up the farm to everybody, so...
Yeah, and his routes per drop back are great. So expect him to, 98%, 91%, 96%. His targets have been 4% and 14%. So if you can get 15% target share against the Cardinals, you're probably scoring a touchdown.
Another guy we talked about a lot in the preseason was Ronald Jones. Well, his ass got benched this week because he can't pass protect. Enter Peyton Barber, 17 for 44 and 2 touchdowns for Mr. Barber. I wouldn't feel excited playing Peyton Barber at all, but it's week 14. You might be dying. Any hope in the world if you put Peyton Barber in your lineup?
No, this is one I would totally avoid. This one I would just totally avoid because you just have no clue.
Playing the Colts
Bruce Arians has gone back and forth so much on this crap all year. It's exhausting. Ronald Jones, it's funny. I did write about him. I kind of stayed away, and I finally wrote about him last week and said, hey, week 9, 10, and 12, his PPR points, 16, 25, and 16. In week 11, only 3 points. But that was a game where the game got out of hand. They were losing by 17. And it wasn't really Peyton Barber that took his work in that game. It was your boy, dare to keep kids off drugs. He had 43% of the snaps as the receiving back that week. So Ronald Jones really coming into this game, you had no reason to think anything other than, wow, Ronald Jones, you can actually feel like starting him as long as the Bucs keep the game close, which it was a game against the Jaguars. Expect the guy to give you somewhere between 10 and 20 fantasy points in a PPR setup. And then, like you said, he screwed the pooch, had issues with the pass blocking. Peyton Barber gets 55% of the rushing attempts. Peyton Barber, is not the guy really they're using in the passing game. That was more of, Dare Ogunbowale, not any targets or anything for Barber. But really, the 2 previous weeks, Ronald Jones has seen 8% and 11% of the targets, was getting a little bit more work in the passing game. Things were looking so good for him, Drake. And now this. And it's probably just back to a just full-on avoid.
We got a lot of great chat going on here in our Periscope chat room here as we talk on StreamYard. Extremely happy with our setup here, so thanks to the folks over there. Let's talk about the Colts. I had a gentleman ask me, his team is looking for a running back, and he's got an opportunity to pick up Jordan Wilkins. Marlon Mack's still out. Wilkins now, he wasn't really ready to go a few weeks ago, and that's why we saw a lot of Jonathan Williams. Everybody blew their wad remaining in fab money on Williams, And then here comes Jordan Wilkins, who was the handcuff all season long, and he leads the team in carries. He got 14 of them. I mean, it kind of feels sneaky. Like you can add Jordan Wilkins and nobody's talking about him. He's got a tough matchup this week with Tampa, but Jordan Wilkins can play.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago on the show when we talked about, you asked me who I would pick up, Wilkins or Williams, and I said it was Wilkins. I just think he's the better player. But Williams had that great game in week 12, so you couldn't trust Wilkins at all coming in, to week 13. And lo and behold, it is what we thought. Wilkins was really the better guy to own. Here's the problem. Yeah. They're using all three of them, Drake. So it's just not an exciting thing. Wilkins, 46% of the rushing attempts. Jonathan Williams, 33%, 17% to Nyheim Hines. They don't have an explosive offense.
It's a boring-ass offense for sure.
Their play volume is solid because Frank Reich is always solid in that regard. And they are passing less. They run more, so that's good. But you need it to be a two-way split. You need one of these guys to go away, and then you could be okay with it. You could live with it. Kind of like what we talked about with Seattle earlier. Mm-hmm. But right now, with it being three guys, it's really hard to stomach. If you're right, Wilkins is the guy that if for some reason you don't have a lot of bidding money and you don't have a lot of money to bid, or you're lower down in your waiver wire order and you can't get one of the other guys, Wilkins is still a guy, that's worth owning. It's just really tough to recommend, playing him this weekend, Drake. And they play Tampa Bay, which is a -7 PPR for the running game. Because why? Because the Bucks think that all you need to do is stop the run, which is thusly they give up everything in the pass. So, you can't expect a lot out of the Indy running game, this coming week. It's still just a tough spot to be in, but Wilkins is the player that, I do like as far as, if I'm talking about a skill set, I like Wilkins more than Williams.
Who's going to be hot, Dwain, in terms of a chalky DFS play, maybe in a GPP, is Zach Pascal, because they don't have anybody else in Indianapolis. Literally the entire receiving corps died. Zach Pascal, 10 targets, 7 for 109, gets the Bucks this week. Why the hell not? You throw Zach out there. Even if you're in a league that starts 3 receivers, you could do worse as your third receiver than Zach Pascal.
Yeah. Marcus Johnson's the guy that you just pivot to him and nobody will own him. I remember we first brought him up on the show a few weeks ago, Drake, and neither one of us even knew who he was. We're like, who is this guy? But 93% routes per drop back this last week, 15% of the targets. So Marcus Johnson is another guy you can think about. We could see the return of Paris Campbell as well. We'll see what happens with that. He's on the mend from the broken hand, and he was starting to come on a little bit. Chester Rogers was just a complete non-factor this last weekend, only 1% of the snaps. I don't know what's going on there.
His name's Chester. That's what's going on.
Chester
the molester. Nobody's putting that guy in the lineup.
Oh, and just real quick, Jack Doyle, 94%, Drake, with Eric Ebron gone. 94% of the snaps, 91% routes per dropback, 30% of the targets. If Jack Doyle's available, he's going to be a tight end 1 the rest of the way.
That's a great call right there. I know we've talked about him in the past. I'm a big Jack Doyle fan. Good call there. Let's move on to the Falcons. It's tough to watch the Falcons, okay, because their line sucks. Ryan is under constant duress. He's getting sacked left and right. I played against the Saints defense last week, so I know exactly how many sacks they got. But with Julio banged up and not playing, Russell Gage, boy, what a nice little player he's been. 9 targets, 5 for 52 and a score. Hooper's still not out there yet. They're throwing all kinds of guys you've never heard of. This week, you get Freeman against a Panthers defense, that can't stop anybody. So, what do you think with this Falcons offense here? Do we have a shot with any of these clowns?
Man, I mean, obviously with Julio out, it does open up these other, avenues. Austin Hooper sounds like he's going to practice or going to try to practice this week. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, we'll see what happens with him. But I mean, the main beneficiary, you already named Russell Gage. He did some nice things, played on 77 or ran around on 77% of Matt Ryan's dropbacks, had 16% of the targets. He's had 2 end zone targets over the last 3 weeks. But Calvin Ridley's been the main guy. So 26, 24, and 20%, of the targets. He's got 2 end zone targets over the last 7 weeks. He's basically not coming off the field. Calvin Ridley now is basically what people drafted him as this summer. he was a 4th, 5th round pick in many, of the bigger leagues that I played in. A lot of people were really high on Calvin Ridley. He did start to slip a little bit towards the end of the summer, but 28, 22, and 17 PPR points over the last 3 weeks. So, I mean, he's the main guy that I think, you continue to trust, but obviously that's what everybody's doing. You get a matchup against Carolina this week, then it's going to be tough against the 49ers, but then it gets better against Jacksonville, and then you get Tampa Bay. So, I mean, he's the guy, and you already mentioned, so Russell Gage. The one other guy that has really seen more snaps was Christian Blake.
Yeah, man.
So he 18% of the targets. He played 90% of the snaps. Yep. He took the Julio role, and it was really Russell Gage staying in the Mohamed Sanu role in the slot, with Calvin Ridley taking Mohamed Sanu's role whenever they're in the 2 wide receiver sets. So Calvin Ridley's not leaving the field. Christian Blake was not leaving the field. So that's another sneaky DFS name. If for some reason Julio doesn't play this weekend, most people aren't thinking of Christian Blake. He scored 12 points in a PPR format last weekend.
He got a ton of looks. They were always throwing him the rock. And here's the real thing. If you're Atlanta, okay, you're not going anywhere. There's no incentive to put Julio Jones on the field anymore. Really, there's no incentive to put Matt Ryan on the field anymore. And Matt Ryan's under contract for like the next 38 years. So I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden, like you said, guys start getting shut down. They're not playing out the amount of snaps. Let's get a look at some younger guys. Keep an eye on that with Atlanta. We talked about the Panthers. They fired Ron Rivera today. I was never a Ron Rivera fan. I don't care if he's won Coach of the Year or he's gone to the Super Bowl. He's a bad in-game coach. He's gotten by with a lot of, defensive smoke and mirrors. He had Cam play out of his mind for a year, but I don't think Rivera was a great coach. I don't know your thoughts on that, but Ian Thomas is a guy who, if Greg Olsen doesn't play, he took a nasty shot in that last game, had a really nice end of 2008 and could be a sneaky back-end tight end 1 for the rest of the season.
Yeah, he could be a sneaky play. We'll have to see what happens with Olsen this week, but I agree. He and Jack Doyle are 2 of the guys that I would be looking at if I needed tight end help this weekend. DJ Moore, he's finally, he's just going off now. 30% of the targets 3 weeks ago, 22% in week 12, 26% in week 13. He's 24% of the targets on the season. Curtis Samuel, 18%. Curtis Samuel's still getting, high leverage looks. He's got 7 targets in the end zone. Listen for DJ Moore, man, his targets in the end zone over the last 3 weeks, he's got 5. That's crazy. That's the most over that span of anybody in the league. But 17 yards, 17 average depth of target for Curtis Samuel. So still getting those deeper looks. And a guy that I wouldn't be surprised to see him have a big game. He did come up with a touchdown last week, had come up a little bit small for owners in weeks 11 and week 12, where he only had 7 and 6 PPR points. But Samuel and Moore are the 2 guys I like the most, especially if Greg Olsen continues to miss. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey is always going to get his 20% target share on the season for Christian McCaffrey.
Unbelievable. I got to say thanks to all the folks out there who've listened to the show, especially all throughout the season. And we're heading into weeks now where maybe your team is out of it, so you don't have anything to play for. But if you're listening, we appreciate it. If you're just a casual fan out there, if you're a guy like Chad Schroeder, who's a huge, league player, and he's won countless major money leagues that I'll never be able to get into, and he's out here watching the show, we appreciate it, and thanks to those guys. Lastly, Dwain, I want to talk about the Bengals. I don't know what moron decided that taking Andy Dalton out of the lineup was a good idea, but boy, they look like a legit football team when Andy Dalton's in the lineup. Now this week you got John Ross returning, super under the radar pickup if you're dying at wide receiver. This is a guy, again, before he got hurt, led them in air yards and touchdowns. So the Bengals have a little life. They got some juice. Yeah. They suck, but hey, they got some juice.
A little bit of juice, like you said a little. So I mean, you
right. It's 90 degrees outside. There's a kid with a lemonade stand. They got 1 cup left. It's half drank. That's how much juice the Bengals have. All right, but it's something.
It's more than half drank. It's like just if you really tilt the cup all the way back, a little bit will trickle down.
The kid pissed in the cup. That's what's left.
Yes, I love to drink piss. Thanks, Jay. So, but yeah, John Ross is coming back. It's just a guy people just need to remember. I mean, and yeah, he's always hurt. But if you look at the way that he was utilized early in the season, He had very heavy, he got a lot of looks, and that was with Andy Dalton. I mean, people forget, it feels like I guess it has been forever, Drake, but week 1, 24% of the targets, week 2, 19% of the targets. I mean, this guy put up 31 and 21 fantasy points in a PPR setup in weeks 1 and 2. So yeah, John Ross is a guy that's pretty much under the radar. He's probably available in almost every single league out there. So he's somebody that's viable, if you're in a super deep league.
Had a question for you in the chat room here. Matt Lawrence asks us, please ask Dwain, who do you start this week? Mike Williams, Tevin Coleman, or Hollywood Brown?
Mike Williams, Tevin Coleman, or Hollywood Brown. All right, let me look, Drake. Who we got? We got the Chargers against Jacksonville. That's a good matchup for receivers, or it's decent. Who do we have next?
Hollywood Brown.
Okay. Yeah, Hollywood Brown, Baltimore's, who are they playing? Sorry, I'm having to do this like on the fly. I hadn't really looked at matchups. Buffalo, so that's a minus 2.9 for receivers. That still doesn't totally scare me though. Like Tre'Davious White doesn't travel, so if you really want to get a guy into a good spot to score some points against Buffalo's secondary, I still think that you can. Overall, they're tough against quarterbacks. And then who was the runner that he named?
Tevin Coleman against the Saints.
God, freaking Tevin Coleman. Jesus.
He's going to be the answer. We're going to say like Mike Williams because we'll say, oh my God, he's going to score. And Josh Hermsmeyer can actually say his name again. And but Tevin Coleman, I think, is going to end up being the guy. It makes no sense. But at the end of the day, you look back and go, that's fantasy.
Yeah, if I'm going through a process though, to where I've got to, work through this, I'm going with the guy that I like the matchup the most, and he has been getting more looks, and that would be Mike Williams. But it's just like you said, it's been this kind of season. Would it surprise me if Tevin Coleman scores 3 touchdowns and then Matt Lawrence unfollows me on Twitter and never listens to our show again? No, I wouldn't be surprised.
I've had guys on Twitter, and God bless them, thank you all for listening, but I this week they apparently think I went against the Bills Mafia. So I had a guy who would DM me questions every week, and I loved it, and I always answer the guy's questions. And I said something he perceived as negative about Buffalo after their win on Thursday. And it's like, you would have thought I murdered the guy's family, right? The guy, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. Bah, bah, bah. All I said was, I think it was Field Yates or one of the guys on ESPN talked about how, they're building something special in Buffalo. And I agree. I live 2 hours from Buffalo. I go to Bills games. I have a million friends who are Bills fans. I hear about the Bills all the time. I live in upstate New York, okay? And they said they're building something special. And I said, the problem with the Bills, Dwayne, is they can't keep anybody that they draft. And they've drafted well. Look at the receivers. Look at the defensive backs. They traded Jason Peters. That's been the problem with the Bills. And then everyone just goes off on me. But they got Cole Beasley, and they got Jordan Poyer, and they got John Brown. God bless you that all these role players are coming through for you this week, okay? But that's been the problem. That's the MO with the Bills, is that you haven't been able to keep guys that you drafted. What about Antonio Brown? Did he want to go to Buffalo, Dwayne?
No, he did not, Drake.
No, but nobody wants to go to freaking Buffalo unless you're Mario
Antonio
Williams.
Brown didn't want to go anywhere.
Yeah.
He didn't want to play.
But again, I hope the best
just
for the
like
Buffalo
pissing
Bills.
off. You like pissing off the Bills Mafia because
they're so insecure.
They bring the heat, though.
They do. God bless them. I'm an Eagles fan. Those fans have heat. The Bills Mafia, they're all fired up. You got a good team, kids. Relax. All right, have some fun. Josh Allen has improved. You're going to make the playoffs. You might even win that damn division. All right, just realize your history and who you really are. Okay. But anybody else you want to touch on here before we get out of here, Dwayne?
I was so involved listening to your diatribe over the Bills. Let me see. Well, hey, how about Anthony Miller finally showed up? Now, part of that was probably Taylor Gabriel being out, but played 88% of the snaps, 100% of the routes per dropback, 34% target share. He's got a end zone target in each of the last 2 weeks, 38% of the air yards for the team last week. He had like 140 yards on Thanksgiving Day. So Anthony Miller looking pretty good. Joe Mixon, one of the biggest busts of the fantasy season. You get to see what it looks like. Finally, whenever the Bengals lead a game, it's Gio Bernard's hardly involved. Not like you can really depend on that. Cincinnati's probably going to lose the rest of their games. But anyway, Mixon, scored 17 fantasy points in a PPR setup. He took 76% of the rushing attempts, was the main guy in the passing game, 54%. And that's the main difference for him and for guys like him and Derrick Henry and some of these guys that are really game script, dependent. And Henry, I know folks are going to say, oh, no, he's not. Yeah, he still is. And it's not because, Deion Lewis is necessarily getting work. They just run the ball less whenever they're, trailing or playing in a super close game. And that hasn't been the case here lately with Henry. They've been, the Titans have been winning, Tannehill is a part of that, obviously. But Mixon, in a game where they led, he ran around on 54% of the dropbacks, only 18% for Gio Bernard, who had been at 55 and 52% the previous 2 weeks when they had lost by 7 and 6 points. So, just looking at Cincinnati, that's really more of just thinking forward towards next year. If this offense can turn the corner, they had a lot of injuries, a lot of bad luck. So we'll see what they do at quarterback. Just real quick on Cleveland, Drake, Kareem Hunt, is slowly creeping upward, as far as the snaps. If you look at Nick Chubb, 73, 57, 59%, Hunt 54, 56, 67%. He's still the receiving back, but his carries are up 17, 25, 29%. So that's putting a little bit of a cap on some of the upside that we used to see with Nick Chubb as far as
Nick Chubb owner right here.
Yeah, and it's still not bad. If you have Nick Chubb, you're going to play him.
Sure.
What it does, though, is you're just not going to see a blowout game where all of a sudden you get the 27, 28 carries out of Nick Chubb. He's probably going to be capped in that 22, 23 carry range. And obviously his targets are down, since Kareem Hunt has came on. So 3%, 9%, and 6% for Chubb over the last 3 weeks, whereas Hunt, 22%, 9%, 15%. And he had a really good reception this last week where he really broke through.
Hunt's like a top 15. I think he's a better PPR back since returning than Nick Chubb is.
No, Chubb's still slightly ahead.
Is he?
Yeah, it's close. So, the average for Hunt is 14 in that time period, and it's almost 15 for Chubb. So, it's really, really close. But Kareem Hunt's been very active. Obviously, folks know Jarvis Landry's been killing it. The one thing, Phillip Lindsay again, Drake, we talked about this a little bit last week, but he's fully taken over the lead running role on the team. So 76% of the rushing attempts in week 12, 68% in week 13. So, whereas he used to be splitting those with Royce Freeman, he's not anymore. Now Freeman's still the guy getting, looks in the passing game, but they're still getting Lindsay enough. He's had 8% of the targets and 11% of the targets, but despite Royce Freeman running a route on 68% of the dropbacks and only 19% for Lindsay, this last week. So those are all things to pay attention to. One other guy that could be, again, this is super deep, another crappy team. I feel like there's so many crappy teams with all these quarterbacks hurt, Drake. But with TJ Hawkinson going to IR, you could see more 11 personnel from Detroit, which is big for Danny Amendola. If you saw it this last weekend, his snaps were at 74% and 85% routes per dropback, 21% of the targets. So Amendola, his issue has been, based on the game plan or based on, the game script, he could just basically evaporate, so he's probably going to be seeing a little bit more work in this new scenario.
Another garbage team before we get out of here. What do you think of Robbie Anderson?
Yeah, it's tough, Drake. I like Robbie Anderson. He's one of those guys. I think, eventually we need to go back and do a recap. Like, okay, let's go back through all the guys and their ADP, where they were drafted, and what did they end up really being worth? But one of the
sounds
big things,
like a show we'll do in 2 weeks.
Well, one of the guys, right? One of the big things this year as far as drafting was that we felt really good about a lot of the receivers between rounds 5 and 10. And I was going back and looking at those today. And the reason I bring this up is Robbie Anderson's one of those guys. He was in that group, of players. He wasn't necessarily at the top of that list, but he's a guy that we felt pretty decent about. He just did nothing. Now, over the last 2 weeks, yes, 19 and 17 PPR points. His average depth of target is great. He's at 19.7, 19.4, and 18.8 over the last 3 weeks. So the beauty of that, and for you folks that follow Josh Hermsmeyer, you already know this. This is really, that's where air yards comes from. You look at all of the passes where the receiver was targeted. You look at the average depth of target. You put those two things together, and you get air yards. So his air yard percentage for the team, 46 and 44% over the last 2 weeks. So he's finally being used that way. Earlier in the season, it wasn't he wasn't seeing as many of those deep looks, and a lot of that may have been due to his health. But he's got 4 targets in the end zone over the last 3 weeks, which is one of the top in the league. So yeah, he's a viable option. He's still not seeing a ton of the targets though, 10%, 17%, and 21%. However, if you're going to be a 20% guy, you want to have, an average depth of target like Robbie Anderson has. So you could definitely do worse than Robbie Anderson.
I remember fighting on a show a year ago with our buddy Jim Day from FF Champs and Tony Sincata about air yards, and they weren't into it, didn't care about it. I love Hermsmeyer's article. Like, to me, that's a great piece. If you go over to establishtheRun.com and you read that article, that's a great way to find guys on the waiver wire who maybe have been dropped, and you go like, man, people just aren't seeing it. Like, it's coming, and then he shows it every single week, man. So really a fine article over there.
Yeah, it is.
And he and I were talking on Twitter, and I didn't realize he actually sort of works in the same industry I do. So kind of cool. But, well, folks, that's going to wrap it up here. So good luck in your playoffs if you're in here on week 14. We hope to see you next week in the semifinals. We will be here for sure. He is Dwain McFarland. You can catch his show with Jay Moyer. The name is...
No, Drake, you got to do it.
Oh, Christ.
Come on, you got to nail it just one time.
RSP Film and Data Podcast.
Almost.
Data and Film Podcast?
You got to add the fantasy. RSP Fantasy Film and Data. The key is you get Jay Moyer, who's one of the best at film breakdowns, and so you can't miss it.
Yeah, 2 really smart guys talking football, unlike this show where it's only 1 smart guy talking football. If you like DFS, though, I do a DFS show. It's called Eat the Chalk. I record that on Wednesdays. Check that out over on iTunes as well. Good luck, everybody. We'll see you next week. For Dwain, I am Brian. Good luck. Keep hustling, my friends.